Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Talk Show. As we all know, we are now constantly being exposed to the term international or internationalization as it applies to Japan. And kokusaika, for instance, or kokusaijin in Japanese, is almost a household term, and I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say so. But when I come to really think of it, I wonder if the term kokusaiteki or international is very appropriate in the light of the fact that this term international presupposes the perpetuation of the nation state, which, to my way of thinking, is perhaps outmoded. And in its place, I think we should emphasize the term intercultural, as in intercultural communication, which is the title of our discussion for today and a week from today. And the need for greater intercultural understanding is very great indeed in the case of us Japanese, who have long been inured to a highly monocultural, monolingual, monoracial, monoethnic entity, which is Japan. And for the purpose of discussing this very interesting and important subject, I think we are very happy indeed in having Dr. John C. Condon with us, who is an associate professor of communication at the International Christian University near Tokyo. And although Dr. Condon, our guest, is scarcely out of his 30s, I understand he's 37 now, he has truly distinguished himself as a first-rate expert, specialist in the area of general semantics, intercultural communication, and other related subjects. And as a matter of fact, Dr. Condon is the author of the book that I hold, which is entitled An Introduction to Intercultural Communication. And in view of the ever-increasing need for us Japanese in particular to be more conversant in the problems of intercultural communication, again, I would like to extend my heartfelt welcome and appreciation to Dr. Condon. We are going to cover the following three items in our discussion today. In the first place, we would like to focus our attention on the growing interest in the subject of intercultural communication, not only in Japan, but in the United States. And I would like very much to invite Dr. Condon to tell us a little bit about the circumstances under which we have come to talk in greater terms and more frequently of the need for intercultural understanding. Secondly, we are going to talk a little bit about the terms that are employed in our discussion of intercultural communication. Such terms, for instance, as culture and the patterns of culture, communication, communicative behavior of a people, and national rhetorics of a people, and so on. And thirdly, to conclude our discussion, we are going to discuss the significance or importance of intercultural observations or studies of intercultural communication. And I think this is obvious in that, after all, we are living in a world, or in a globe, which is shrinking very rapidly day by day. So with this preface at the outset, I would like to introduce to you Dr. John C. Condon, an associate professor of communication at the International Christian University. Dr. Condon, welcome to Talk Show once again.
Thank you.
I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago that I asked you to appear on a program, and at that time I think we discussed
nonverbal communication.
Nonverbal communication, which I understand is part of a very important part of intercultural communication. Now today we are going to talk about intercultural communication, and as I said at the outset, I'm very curious to know a little bit about the circumstances in which people began to be interested in intercultural communication, at least in America and in the academic community of the United States. Would you start our discussion with a very brief description of the circumstances?
Let me try. It's a difficult question. There's a kind of grand answer, I suppose, that people are now more aware of interdependence. You spoke of the shrinking world and so on. People are aware that a decision in the Middle East affects societies throughout the world and so on. There's a realization, perhaps a greater realization, that many major problems in the world cannot be settled by single nations alone. So on. This may be part of it, increased travel,
yes.
So on. But I suspect academically the reason is a little bit different. Many of the disciplines that traditionally would have been concerned with, or you would think would be concerned with intercultural communication, have somehow omitted or left out that particular area. Anthropology, for example, which has pretty much captured the market on culture. I think anthropologists generally have been interested in single cultures until fairly recently, mostly with distant cultures that other people had not studied, and so on, and that relationships between people from different societies have been pretty much left out. Linguists, who are certainly interested in communication, I think it's fair to say, have been more concerned with describing the rules of language rather than the consequences of language, particularly across cultures. Political scientists have had their own interest in international relations, but as you mentioned in your introduction, they tend to be more of a political or national nature rather than intercultural. And later, perhaps, when we talk about some of these terms, the distinction between nation and culture becomes very, very important. So I have the feeling that intercultural relations have been on the periphery of many different disciplines, but have never been a major focus. In my own particular field of communication, which in the United States grows out of the speech tradition, and before that the rhetorical tradition, going back to Aristotle and even before, there's been very, very little concern with speaking to, let alone communicating with, people from other societies. In the classical tradition, a barbarian was anybody who was not a Greek, and you didn't do so much communication, or you didn't concern yourself so much. Again, maybe it was more power rather than attempts to understand other people. And I've read that when some of the early Europeans came to North and South America, they came prepared by reading Rousseau and trying to understand the nature of the noble savage and so on, rather than trying to describe the nature of the people they would actually come in contact with. So maybe it's curious to ask why there hasn't been so much interest up until now. But for whatever the reason, the interest has grown a great deal.
During the last, you would say, how many years?
I would say roughly from about 1960.
From 1960.
Edward Hall's book, The Silent Language, which I understand you translated into Japanese, was an extremely influential book in alerting people, one, to the fact that communication consisted of much more than simply words speaking, and two, that we carry with us all kinds of cultural assumptions. And in that book, Hall argues that culture itself is a system of communication. And so many people have read this book, and so many people have become intrigued with the ideas that this was a central force. When I was working on my doctoral degree in 1962, I was doing my study in Mexico, primarily of relationships between the United States and Mexicans. And this, I think, is symptomatic. The graduate school at Northwestern University, where I got my degree, would not allow Spanish as the graduate school language because the dean of the graduate school argued no serious scholarship had been done in Spanish, and therefore I was to take my examination in French, even though it had nothing to do with my subject matter. Nowadays, of course, almost any language that fits what one is studying is appropriate. There's been a great deal of sophistication and awareness since about 1960. You can find earlier interests, so-called national character studies and so on, going back at least 20 years before that. But the real interest in intercultural communication, I would say, is pretty much a product of the past 15 years.
I see. And on the basis of the scholarship of the last 15 years you mentioned, of course, you have recently authored this book, which I hold now, entitled An Introduction to Intercultural Communication. May I so assume that perhaps this work of yours represents one of the very first works dealing specifically with the subject of intercultural communication? May I so assume, sir?
Yes. How can I say?
Don't be bashful.
There are many other books. Almost any book that's talking about people anywhere is talking about cultural patterns of communication.
Yes.
But to attempt to survey the area, I was one of the first foolish enough, I guess you can say, to try to talk about the many areas that might be included in this. It is a kind of survey. You have many books talking about nonverbal behavior, about aspects of relationships between particular societies, many studies on language and culture and so on, but to try to put them together and say this is a field in itself, or this is a way of looking at relationships. Apparently this is one of the first anyway.
You use the adjective foolish, but I think I would use the word adjective ambitious or daredevil.
Foolish, I think, is a good adjective.
So this book, of course, represents an interdisciplinary approach to this very complex area known as intercultural communication. Am I right?
Yes, and perhaps this is a clue to the recent development of this as a field. Interdisciplinary studies, until fairly recently, I think, were not so respectable. They were never in this field or not in that field, and so somehow they were regarded as secondary or less important.
Soft.
Yes, too soft. But again, interdisciplinary studies in the past 15 or 20 years have grown tremendously, particularly in the United States.
I'm sure that this kind of approach has its practical utility. Say, for instance, Japanese businessmen dealing more and more with foreign businessmen, or American diplomats dealing more and more with non-American diplomats, not only from the Western world, but also from the developing part of the world, where Western values and ways of thinking and modes of behavior do not necessarily exist. So I'm sure that an approach like this, which is represented by your work, for instance, does have a great deal of practical or pragmatic utility value. Am I right in so assuming, Dr. Condon?
We would hope so, but I'm not sure that all the businessmen would agree. There is what Professor Howell at the University of Minnesota talks about as the myth of the universal communicator, which he finds very widespread in international businessmen particularly. This is the idea that there are certain people who, by force of personality, are able to express themselves, communicate well, no matter where they go. And that, of course, you have to study something of a language in another society and so on. But beyond that, simply following common sense or doing what comes natural, somehow this will get you through. I doubt that this is the case. But as for severe training programs in intercultural communication, this is still not developed as much as I think it will be in the next many.
Of course, ethnocentrism is something which dies very hard.
Yes, indeed.
Well, I would like to move on to the second item on our agenda, which is the definition of the terms that are employed very extensively in the study of intercultural communication. And I would appreciate it if you would start your discourse with your definition of culture as it is used in intercultural communication. The reason I ask you this question is that the term culture in Japan, or in Japanese, as it is in English, is used in a variety of ways, and sometimes there are some people who are foolish enough or bold enough to say that in the United States there is a civilization, but there is no culture. So in order to dispel this kind of misconception as to the academic use in the behavioral sciences of the term culture, I hope you will make your definition known to us. And then after that you can talk about the patterns of culture, communication or communications in the plural, and communicative behavior, and all the rest of it. So the floor is yours,
all right,
Dr.
Thank you. You ask all the hard questions. The word culture is used in many different ways in the United States too, and even in academic circles. Even within anthropology, I believe, the first use of the term, or the first published use of the term, was about 100 years ago. And scholars who have tried to compile lists of definitions of culture have come up with well over 100 different definitions used by different people. All of these terms that you mentioned are of course words, and different people are going to define them differently for their own purposes. And I personally don't like to begin with definitions because that puts me in a box and then that I'm stuck with it. So let me say a couple of things of what culture is not, at least. As you suggested earlier, I think culture and nation are not the same. Within a single nation, it is possible to have many different cultures.
Or subcultures.
Or even cultures.
Or cultures, yes, right.
Or ethnic groups. Many of these words are used interchangeably. In Tanzania, for example, where I taught for about a year, there are something like 120 different tribes, 120 different languages.
Not dialects, but different languages. Different
languages, and considerable differences in lifestyles, what people eat and how they rear their children, etc., etc., etc.
Yes.
So that this concept of a nation, which is a political concept, and in the case of so many African nations, of course, was determined in Europe, where they got out the rulers and they drew the lines and they said this is one nation, this is another. A nation can contain within it a variety of cultures. Or in the case of, let's say, Western Canada and the western part of the United States, you have really fairly similar cultures, even though they are divided by a national boundary. So when we talk about culture, what we're talking about in part are those kinds of behavior, those assumptions, those beliefs that a group of people share in common. Language, of course, is a very important part, but also, as I mentioned, child rearing, the kinds of jokes you laugh at, ritual behavior, holidays, and so on. And in this sense, I think it's not fair to say the United States has no culture, or that any place has no culture. Wherever there are people bound together, there is a culture. We tend sometimes to use the word to describe people someplace else, perhaps. But so much of our own behavior, no matter who we are, is influenced by the society in which we grew up. That it's only when we come in contact with somebody outside of that society that we realize how influenced we are, how arbitrary these patterns are.
Right. What about communication, or communications in the plural?
Communications in the plural is often used more for mass media, I think, or technological communication. Communication, at least as I talk about it here,
in the singular,
in the sense of intercultural communication, is more person-to-person or face-to-face or back-to-back communication. Two people coming together. And that's about as much maybe as you want to say in defining the term. Whenever two people come together, whether they are speaking or not, so long as they recognize the presence of the other
Yes.
and interpret that person's behavior as meaning something,
Yes.
whether they understand it or not, there is some kind of communication. And so the study of intercultural communication is primarily what happens when a person from one society interacts with or comes together with a person from some other society and makes interpretations, accurate or inaccurate, through speech or not through speaking, about the meaning of the other person's behavior. So it's a very broad concept, and yet I think it has to be that broad.
Yes. Of course, there's another technical term which I think is communicative behavior of a certain group of people, but I think you have described what it's all about very succinctly already. I have another technical term in mind, which is the national rhetorics of a certain group of people. How would you define that term? I think I came across this particular term when I read, I forgot, I read a book written by a professor of communication at the University of Wisconsin. I cannot recall his name. And obviously this particular phrase was his coinage. How would you define that term?
What should we say? Traditionally, the word rhetoric was concerned with persuasion. How you organize your symbols, primarily speaking, in order to convince another person of whatever it is you want to convince him of, that your idea is right, that he should vote for you, he should buy your product, and so on. The word rhetoric now has a broader meaning, I think, to include elements of style, eloquence, not in the old-fashioned tradition, but anything that sounds appropriate, convincing, etc. And if there is an idiom or if there is a style which characterizes a whole society or a nation, at least in contrast to a style or idiom that would characterize another group speaking the same language, then I suppose you can talk about that as a national rhetoric. So that the American style of speaking, for example, is in many ways different from a British style of speaking, even though both are speaking English. And if you're contrasting societies with even greater differences, then let's say if in Japan a speaker begins by apologizing, and if in the United States a speaker begins by telling a joke, then these are elements of a kind of national or cultural, maybe we should say, rhetoric. I've been intrigued with some American patterns, which I guess I would include in a cultural rhetoric, such as a pattern of three, which I find very intriguing. There are many, many times when an American speaker will string together three adjectives. Tall, dark, and handsome. Win, place, and show. Blood, sweat, and tears.
What about us?
I don't know.
2 or 4 or 3 or what?
You are in a better position to answer that than me. But I have the feeling, even in my own writing, that a person will maybe think of one term and then another term and then stop, even if he said all he wants to say, in order to find a third term that will fit because it somehow sounds better. And that when you're telling jokes, if you're telling a narrative joke in the United States, one person comes someplace and he meets this person, and then he meets a second person, and then he meets this third person, and people in the United States know that's where the funny part is going to be, because it's on the third point.
Very interesting.
Or in fairy tales, so often there are three characters, 3 billy goats, or 3 little pigs, or the king has 3 daughters, or the king has 3 sons, and it's always the third, usually the youngest, significantly, who marries the frog, or whatever it might be. So I think there is something about a threeness which is not required in English, and which may be found in other societies too, but somehow has a natural sort of sound, a natural kind of ring to it, and perhaps that could be included as a part of a national
Sounds
rhetoric.
Extremely interesting, yes. Well, I'm afraid time is almost up, but I would like you to conclude this part of a program with a very brief and succinct description of what you consider to be the significance of intercultural observation. I think you have about 1.5 minutes.
The significance in 1.5 minutes. Well, the significance of the awareness, let's stick with that. If we assume that communication is conveyed by words alone, we are likely to misinterpret much behavior. Let me give, if we have time, one very simple example. Suppose there is a visitor at Shinjuku Station who goes up to a Japanese student and says, "Excuse me, do you speak English?" What the student is likely to assume is that this person is lost, needs help, cannot read the kanji, and so on. On the other hand, in the same situation, if the student goes up to this foreign visitor and says, "Excuse me, do you speak English?" Probably what is intended is, "May I practice my English?"
On you.
Yes. So what is being communicated, what is conveyed in the communication is not in the words alone, but in the assumptions in that situation. And very often we're in situations where we think we understand because we know the words, or because we interpret them from our own frame of reference. But from the other person's point of view, there's a very different definition of what is going on.
Well, I'm afraid time is really up, and I'll be looking forward with great anticipation to a continuation of this discussion a week from today. And thank you very much, Dr. Hunt.
Thank you.
今私がここに持っております書物のですね、著者に今日はおいでいただきました。ジョン・ C ・コンドン博士、国際クリス教大学の准教授をしておられるコミュニケーションの専門家です。実は数年前にもこの非言語コミュニケーションということについてコンドン先生をお招きしてですね、いろいろとお話し合いをし、特にこの何て言いますか、ノンバーバルコミュニケーションの実例をですね、いろいろな形で見せていただいたので、あるいは古い聴取者の方々、ご記憶があるかと思いますが、その同じコンドン博士に今日はおいでをいただきまして、インターカルチャラルコミュニケーションということについてお話し合いをいたしました。でしばしば日本においてもこの国際化だとか、あるいは国際人だとか、あるいはその国際的感覚の要請の必要性だとかというようなことが説かれるわけです。で、国と国との間という意味では確かに国際ということであり得るわけですし、世界に今150いくつかの主権国家があることを考えますと、この国というもの、あるいは国際という感覚をですね、無視することができないのは言うまでもありません。しかしながらよく考えてみますると、この国という次元でものを考えるよりはですね、やはりこの文化という次元でものを考えることがますます今後必要になってくるんじゃないかというような気がするんです。でその理由として私はですね、そうですね、一つにはその日本の場合ですと、この一国一文化ということがですね、ほぼ定着をしておると。したがって、日本には日本人しか原則として住んでいないと、少数民族の問題ございますけれども、一国家一民族一言語という公式が成り立つわけですけれども、他の国、150いくつの他の国の場合を見ますると、さっき近藤先生おっしゃったように、一つの国の中にですね、いくつものその文化が、あるいはいくつもの違った言語が共存をしているという場合があるわけです。したがって、これらの国々の人にしてみればですね、この一つの国、必ずしも一文化ではないんだというような、世界的な常識に触れやすいし、また理解しやすいと。ところが我々の場合には、一国一文化ということでですね、何か他の国の人々とのいろいろな接触というものをですね、国というような次元だけで考えがちである。文化という次元がなかなか入り込んでこないというかなり重要なマイナスがあるように思うんです。で、今後ますます国際化時代とやらでですね、我々日本人も外との関わりにその運命をかけていかなければならないという時代がやってまいりました。それだけにですね、文化あるいは異文化の人々とどのように関わりを持ち接触をしていくかということは非常に重要になってきたと。そういう時も折も折にですね、近藤先生のような比較的お若い方ですが、この分野において非常に大きな業績を上げられた専門家をお招きしてですね、今日はとりあえずその入り口のところでお話し合いをしたわけで、来週またですね、さらに 詳しく突っ込んだお話し合いができればと、こう願っています。それではごきげんよう。